Hello, and welcome to The Archive. I'm Jen, your host. Thank you for joining me for another episode. In today's episode, we're asking about the Odyssey. Why do we still call Odysseus a hero? Content warning. This episode includes non-graphic discussion of war, enslavement, execution, and mutilation in the Odyssey. Please listen at your discretion. In 2026, Christopher Nolan brought one of humanity's oldest surviving stories back to the cinema. For a lot of people, this will be their first real encounter with the Odyssey. They'll meet the clever king who escaped the Cyclops, listened to the Sirens, survived monsters and angry gods, and spent years trying to get home from Troy. Most of us know the label before we know much about the man himself, hero. He is one of ancient Greece's most famous figures, a brilliant strategist, a survivor, and the mind behind some of the most memorable deceptions in Western literature. But spend a little time with Homer's poem, and that word starts to wobble. Odysseus lies constantly to enemies, strangers, allies, and members of his own family. His curiosity puts his men in danger. His pride turns an escape into a curse. He can be patient, tender, and astonishingly perceptive. He can also be ruthless. His intelligence saves lives. It also helps him decide which lives can be lost. That tension isn't something a modern adaptation imposed on the story. It was there from the beginning. Thousands of ancient stories were once performed, copied, and admired. Many disappeared. Some survive only as a name, a fragment, or a reference inside somebody else's work. The Odyssey survived. For nearly 3,000 years, people have translated it, taught it, challenged it, and made new stories from it. They have admired Odysseus as a model of intelligence and condemned him as a liar. He has become an explorer, a veteran, a husband, an exile, a colonizer, and an extraordinary man making his way through a single day in Dublin. Every generation seems to recognize something in him, but not always the same thing. That is the question I keep coming back to. Why has humanity spent nearly 3,000 years returning to Odysseus? Asking whether he deserves the word hero gets us part of the way. By our usual idea of a moral hero, the answer becomes uncomfortable very quickly. But if we judge him only by the values of ancient epic, we risk pretending his own world had no doubts about him. Why does the journey home still feel familiar when almost everything about Odysseus's world is distant from our own? And why does the word hero keep clinging to a man who refuses to sit quietly inside it? To understand that, we need to go back beyond the monsters, the ruins, and even Homer, to a time when the Odyssey was already changing shape. Section 1. Before there was a hero. Before the Odyssey became marks on a page, it lived in a human voice. The story had breath, rhythm, and listeners. Its performers, often called aoidoi, drew on repeated phrases, familiar scenes, and strong rhythmic patterns. Those structures helped them carry an enormous narrative without fixing every performance into exactly the same words. They weren't simply reciting a finished novel from memory. The rhythm helped bring the next phrase to mind. A familiar phrase could carry a name, a ship, or the arrival of dawn. One episode could open out while another became shorter. Listeners knew the journey, even when the telling shifted beneath them. There's something very Odyssean about that. The story survived by turning without becoming unrecognizable. It also makes the question, who was Homer, rather harder than it sounds. An exceptional poet may have given one or both epics much of the shape we know, or different poets may have worked inside the same inherited tradition. Either way, the poems probably passed through several stages before their written forms became relatively stable. We do not have enough evidence to reduce the tradition to one blind man wandering from city to city. But whoever stood behind the name Homer did not invent this world from nothing. The poet inherited names, scenes, formulas, and memories that were already old. Later performers inherited them in turn. So did the scribes and the scholars who preserved the poem. Even Homer was joining a story already underway. For a long time, the world behind the Greek epics seemed almost unreachable. Troy stood close to legend. Mycenae, Pylos, and Sirens were names attached to kings and wars whose history was difficult to separate from poetry. Archaeology hasn't proved Homer true, but it has made the human world beneath the poem more tangible. In 2015, a team working in an olive grove near the palace of Nestor at Pylos broke through hard-baked clay and found bronze. As the team dug deeper, the outline of an undisturbed grave appeared. Inside lay a man buried around 1450 BCE, surrounded by weapons, gold, ivory, beads, and carved seals. Thousands of objects had been placed around one body. We don't know his name. An ivory plaque bearing a griffin gave him the name we use now, the Griffin Warrior. Near his right arm lay a small stone, face down and sealed beneath a crust of limestone. Nothing on the surface gave away what was underneath. Conservators worked on it for more than a year. Then the crust began to release a battle. The Pylos combat agate is only 3.6 centimeters long. On that tiny surface, one warrior drives forward while another falls. Muscles turn beneath skin. Weapons, jewelry, and expressions survive in the details so fine that the naked eye can barely make them out. The revelation did not come when the object first left the earth. It emerged slowly under magnification as an image made 3,500 years ago came back into focus. I find the scale of it hard to take in. We tend to associate a sophisticated civilization with something enormous, a palace, a city wall, a royal tomb. Here, that sophistication survives on a stone smaller than a thumb. There is no evidence that the Griffin Warrior was Odysseus. He lived centuries before the poem was composed, and before the period usually associated with a possible Trojan War. The agate makes an easy picture of the distant past impossible to maintain. The societies behind some of the poem's inherited memories were neither isolated nor culturally simple. People, objects, and artistic ideas traveled considerable distances. Palace centers could organize wealth and power on a large scale. Stories may have moved through some of the same networks, though no excavation can show us exactly which tale traveled where. Then that palatial world fractured. Around the end of the Bronze Age, many of the major palace systems on mainland Greece collapsed. Settlements were destroyed or abandoned. Long-distance networks changed. At Pylos, clay tablets recording the business of the kingdom survived partly because the fire that destroyed the palace baked them hard. The destruction preserved fragments of the bureaucracy it brought to an end. Afterwards, Linear B disappeared from use on the mainland. There is still no single explanation for the collapse. Environmental pressure, conflict, migration, political instability, and weaknesses within the palace economies may all have contributed. It wasn't one dramatic night when civilization vanished. But the old order did not survive intact. Centuries later, as the Odyssey moved towards the form we know, its world contained layers. Some details may carry echoes of the Bronze Age, others belong much more closely to the lives of later singers and audiences. The poem is not a photograph of one historical moment. It is more like a landscape made from memories of different ages. Stories may have carried names, places, and images across that distance, changing as they traveled. We cannot know exactly what an oral tradition remembered or for how long. Emotional power alone did not guarantee that the Odyssey would survive. People had to keep choosing it. So performers carried it and scribes copied it onto papyrus and parchment. Scholars compared versions. Teachers put Homer in front of generations of students. Byzantine copyists kept the Greek text moving. Translators opened it to new languages. Printing presses multiplied what hands had once reproduced, one manuscript at a time. The poem traveled through voice, ink, animal skin, paper, and human voice. It also benefited from preservation power, education, and luck. Other stories disappeared because their texts were lost or because people stopped copying them. That explains how the Odyssey remained available, but not why people kept returning to it or making something new from it. For that, we need the man inside the poem, and Homer makes us wait for him. Before we meet Odysseus, we meet his reputation. Section 2, the man of many turns. Odysseus doesn't appear until the 5th book. The Odyssey begins in Ithaca, where he has been absent for 20 years. Telemachus was an infant when his father left, and he knows him through stories. Penelope remembers the man, but cannot know whether he is alive, or what 20 years might have made of him. The suitors fill the palace and begin to treat his absence as proof of his death. Odysseus dominates the opening without appearing in it. Before we meet the man, we see the legend and the damage left by his disappearance. When the poem finally takes us to him, he isn't fighting a monster. He is sitting alone at the edge of Calypso's island. The island offers safety from the sea that has broken his ships and taken his men. But Odysseus is not free to leave. He sits facing the water and cries for a shoreline he cannot see. Calypso has kept him there for years. She can offer comfort, protection, and even freedom from age and death. Odysseus wants something far less perfect, a mortal life. He wants a wife who is aged, a son he does not know, and a kingdom that may no longer recognize him. He eventually reaches the Phaeacians without a ship, possessions, or even a name he is willing to give. At the court of King Alcinous, he hears another singer, and Demodocus performs songs about Troy and the Phaeacians. Ask for more. The unidentified stranger pulls his cloak over his head. Each time the song pauses, Odysseus lowers the cloak, wipes his face, and lifts his cup. When it begins, again, he covers his face and starts to cry. Then Homer reaches for a startling comparison. Odysseus is like a woman throwing herself over her husband's body as conquerors close around her, ready to drag her into slavery. Everyone else in the room hears Troy becoming entertainment. Homer places the man who helped sack Troy inside the grief of someone watching her own city fall. Alcinous notices and asks the stranger who he is and why these songs hurt him. Only then does Odysseus give his name and begin to tell his own story. The Cyclops, Circe, the underworld, the Sirens, Scylla, and Charybdis. These are the adventures most of us picture when we hear the word Odyssey, and they are largely narrated by Odysseus himself. That doesn't mean the adventures are invented. The poem gives us no grounds for that certainty, but it does make point of view impossible to ignore. Odysseus is both the hero and the storyteller. He controls the order and the emphasis. He decides what to say about his men, what the gods demanded, and why he made each choice. A man famous for deception becomes one of the main sources for his own legend. That leaves us with a problem we still recognize. How much of any hero's reputation belongs to what happened, and how much belongs to the person who lived to tell it? Before we judge him, we need to be careful with the word hero. We usually expect a hero to be morally admirable. We think of courage, protection, self-sacrifice, and care for people with less power. Ancient Greek epic valued courage and endurance too, but it also cared about birth, strength, status, protecting one's household, and preserving one's reputation. Kleos meant fame carried by report and song, the name that might keep traveling after the body was gone. Odysseus has something else the poem values: metis, cunning, intelligence, strategy, and the ability to see a route that brute strength misses. And before the poem even gives us his name, it reaches for another word. Tell me, muse, of the man of many turns. The Greek word behind those final words, in polytropos, it can suggest many turns, many ways, many devices, or many wanderings. No single English word quite contains it. Then again, no single word quite contains Odysseus. He is a king, warrior, sailor, husband, and father. He is also a beggar, guest, captive, storyteller, and liar. He changes his appearance, his name, and his account of himself according to the danger in front of him. That flexibility is his great advantage. It is also why nobody around him can be completely certain of which version of Odysseus they are dealing with. The Cyclops episode shows us both sides. Odysseus and his men enter the cave of Polyphemus. They find baskets of cheese, pens crowded with lambs and kids, and vessels filled with milk and whey. His companions urge him to take what they can and leave. Odysseus refuses. He wants to meet the owner. He expects the kind of gift that belongs to Xenia, the ancient obligations between host and stranger. Then Polyphemus returns. He drives in the flock, rolls an enormous stone across the entrance, and lights a fire. The men who expected hospitality are suddenly visible in the flames, with daylight sealed behind them. Polyphemus does not welcome the strangers, feed them, and ask them questions later. He traps them. Then he kills them and eats several of them. Odysseus cannot overpower him. If they kill the Cyclops immediately, nobody will be able to move the stone blocking the cave. So Odysseus uses metis. He gives Polyphemus strong wine. He tells him his name is Nobody. When the Cyclops collapses, the men heat the point of an olive wood stake in the fire and drive it into his eye. When the neighboring Cyclopses ask who is hurting him, Polyphemus answers nobody. So they leave him to it. At dawn, Odysseus tries his surviving men beneath the Cyclops' sheep. Polyphemus sits at the entrance and runs his hands over every animal as it passes. He feels the wool above. He never finds the men holding their breath underneath. It is a wonderful escape. It is also the moment when Odysseus should stop. As the ship pulls away, he begins to taunt the blinded Cyclops. A rock crashes into the water near them. His crew beg him to be quiet. He calls out again. Then he shouts his heroic signature across the water. Laertes! If anyone asks who blinded you, tell them Odysseus did it. The sacker of cities, Laertes, son whose home is Ithaca. That is vanity, certainly. But naming the deed also claims it. A man called Nobody cannot receive Kleos. If this victory is going to survive in song, the world needs to know who achieved it. Polyphemus calls on his father, Poseidon. Odysseus claims credit for the escape and makes his journey home more dangerous. It would be tempting to trace every later death to this one mistake. It would also be far too tidy. Homer does not make responsibility that simple. Some men are already dead. Other enemies will destroy. Odysseus will conceal information, and his companions will kill the cattle of the sun, despite explicit warnings. Divine hostility matters, so do hunger, fear, pride, and command. The blame never settles in one place. The Sirens reveal a different use of the same intelligence. Their promise is not simply pleasure. It is knowledge of Troy, of suffering, and of events beyond the limits of one human life. Odysseus wants to hear them. He softens wax in his hands and presses it into his crew's ears. They bind him upright against the mast. When the song reaches the ship, Odysseus strains towards it and signals to be released. The men bend harder over their oars. Two of them rise only to pull the ropes tighter. He knows he will not resist the song, so he makes sure the ropes, not his judgment, make the final decision. Scylla takes that option away. Odysseus has been warned that the ship cannot pass without loss. If he sails towards the whirlpool Charybdis, everyone may die. If he passes Scylla, 6 men will be taken. There is no route that saves them all, but Odysseus does not tell the crew the full cost. The 6 men are taken from the moving ship without knowing that their commander had been warned. Odysseus remembers their voices. They cried out to me, calling me by name for the last time, their hearts in anguish. The name that demanded recognition outside the Cyclops' cave now comes back as the last cry of men who trusted him. Was this leadership a decision that preserved more lives, or was it betrayal because 6 men paid the price without being told? Homer moves on without settling the argument. Seen this way, the monsters do more than delay the journey. They put intelligence, desire, duty, and power under pressure, and they are too unruly to become tidy symbols. What do we admire in somebody who survives? And what are we willing to excuse because he did? By the time Odysseus finishes, the Phaeacians know his name and his suffering. They agree to carry him home. Telling the right story may restore a reputation, but it cannot restore life. Before he reaches Ithaca, Odysseus enters a palace where intelligence cannot negotiate an escape. He has to speak with the dead. Section 3. The stranger at home. Circe sends Odysseus to the underworld to seek Tiresias. At the edge of the ocean, he cuts a trench and pours in the offerings. Then he waits as the dead gather. Among them is his mother, Anticlea. She was alive when he left for Troy. Odysseus only learns that she has died when he sees her standing before him. She tells him what has happened in Ithaca. Penelope is still waiting. Telemachus has grown up without him. Laertes has withdrawn into grief. She says her own longing for her absent son helped bring about her death. Odysseus reaches for her. 3 times I sprang towards her, longing to hold her. 3 times she slipped from my hands like a shadow or a dream. Until now, most of the losses have happened around him. Ships broken, companions killed, years consumed. Here, he discovers that the journey has also been taking lives in rooms he could not see. He also meets Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Iliad. Achilles won the kind of Kleos a Greek hero was supposed to want. Glory, powerful enough to keep his name alive after an early death. Among the dead, the bargain looks very different. Achilles would rather work as the poorest living man than rule over everyone in the underworld. His fame survived. It simply cannot give him warmth, touch, or one more day beneath the sun. That makes Odysseus's later refusal of Calypso's immortality easier to understand. An endless life away from Ithaca might preserve his body, but it would separate him from the mortal relationships that make him who he is. Even then, Tiresias warns him that reaching home will not mean the journey is over. When the Phaeacians finally carry Odysseus back to Ithaca, he does not see the island approaching. He is asleep. They lift him from the ship, place him on the shore, and stack his possessions beside him. By the time he wakes, they are gone. Mist covers the harbor, the paths, and the hills. Odysseus is surrounded by everything he has managed to save, yet he cannot recognize the ground beneath him. Athena clears his sight, then disguises him as an old beggar. There is a practical reason for this. Armed suitors occupy his palace, and Odysseus does not know which servants remain loyal. But the disguise also gives us one of the strangest truths in the poem. He has spent years longing to come home. Once he arrives, he still cannot enter it as himself. Modern readers often recognize something familiar in his suspicion, deception, and need to control every encounter. Some have used the language of trauma or moral injury. Those ideas can be useful, but we do not need to diagnose an ancient character to notice what Homer puts in front of us. Odysseus has learned that trust can be dangerous. Even on Ithaca, he watches, tests, and lies before allowing himself to be known. He begins with Eumaeus, the enslaved swineherd who has remained loyal to the household. When the unknown beggar approaches, the dogs rush at him. Eumaeus drives them back and brings the stranger into a shelter. He gives them a seat and food before asking for a true name. Eumaeus has very little power, yet he preserves Xenia instinctively. Polyphemus had enormous power and rejected it. Odysseus answers that kindness with another invented story. Telemachus returns soon afterwards. Athena briefly removes the disguise, and the elderly beggar seems to change in front of him. His posture, skin, hair, and clothing are restored. Telemachus looks away because he assumes he must be facing a god. For most of his life, Odysseus has been a collection of other people's memories. Now that legend is standing inside a swineherd's shelter, asking to be believed. So the reunion is not purely emotional. Odysseus is asking a son who barely knows him to trust him and to help kill the men inside the palace. The recognitions that follow are quieter, and each person knows Odysseus in a different way. Argos needs no test at all. Once trained for the hunt, the dog now lies outside the palace on a heap of dung, neglected and covered in vermin. As the beggar approaches, Argos lifts his head, his ears drop, his tail moves, but he no longer has the strength to come closer. Odysseus turns his face away so that Eumaeus will not see him cry. He cannot kneel beside Argos. without risking the plan. He cannot speak his name or touch him as his master. The dog waits 20 years, sees him once, and dies. Euryclea recognizes him through touch. Penelope orders Odysseus' old nurse to wash the stranger's feet. As Euryclea turns his leg in her hands, her fingers find the scar left by a boar hunt in his youth. Athena can change his appearance. She cannot remove the history carried by his body. His foot drops and the basin tips. Water runs across the floor. Euryclea looks up, joy and grief arriving together as she understands whom she is touching. Odysseus pulls her close and demands silence before she can expose him. Penelope is harder to convince. While Odysseus crossed the sea, Penelope held the suitors off at a loom. They have been consuming the household and pressuring her to choose a new husband. Penelope promises she will decide when she is finished weaving a burial shroud for Laertes. By day, where everyone can see her, she adds to it. At night, by lamplight, she unpicks the same threads. She keeps the deception going for 3 years. This is not passive waiting. Penelope survives through patience, intelligence, and careful control of what other people think they know. So when the disguised Odysseus finally speaks to her, she does not accept his claims simply because she wants them to be true. She questions him, compares the details, and withholds judgment. The suitors, meanwhile, have turned Xenia inside out. They are guests who refuse to leave. They eat Odysseus's food, drink his wine, pressure his wife, and plot his son's death. To Homer's audience, this is more than greed or bad manners. It is an attack on one of the obligations holding social life together. When the bow is brought into the hall, each suitor tries and fails to string it. The beggar takes the weapon, strings it, and sends an arrow through the line of axe heads. Once the doors are secured, the contest becomes a killing. One suitor is still lifting a cup when the first arrow hits him. Tables overturn, the men reach for weapons that are no longer there. Their appeals for mercy fail. The poem presents the killings as punishment, a restoration of Odysseus's household, but it does not make the violence clean. Afterward, enslaved women accused of sexual and household disloyalty are made to carry out the bodies and wash away the blood. Odysseus orders their deaths. Telemachus rejects the method his father proposed and hangs them instead. Melanthius, the enslaved goat herd who helped the suitors, is mutilated with extreme cruelty. We should not hurry past that because it makes the homecoming harder to celebrate. The society Homer depicts is patriarchal, aristocratic, and dependent upon slavery. That context helps us understand why the poem presents these killings as order restored. It does not erase the people killed to restore it. Leaving them out would give us a more comfortable hero. It would not give us Homer's Odysseus. Only after the hall has been cleared does the poem move towards the recognition we have been waiting for. And even now, Penelope is not convinced. She orders that their marriage bed be moved. Odysseus reacts immediately because the bed cannot be moved. Long before Troy, a living olive tree grew where their room would eventually stand. Odysseus trimmed its branches, shaped the trunk into one of the bedposts, and built the chamber around it. The room encloses the tree. The bed is still joined to a root in the Ithacan soil. To move it, somebody would have to cut through the bed he made, and through a secret only husband and wife should know. That is what finally convinces Penelope. As welcome as the sight of land to shipwrecked swimmers, so welcome was her husband to her. She puts her arms around his neck and does not let go. After everything the sea has taken from Odysseus, Homer makes him the sight of land for somebody else. I think that is one of the most beautiful choices in the poem. Penelope does not recognize him through his public reputation, his strength, or even his scar. She recognizes the man who knows how their home was built. Neither of them is the person they were 20 years ago. Penelope recognizes what they built together, still rooted beneath them. Even then, their recognitions are not quite finished. Odysseus finds Laertes in the orchard, wearing old clothes and working the soil. His father has aged in grief and withdrawn from the household, and Odysseus tests him with another lie. Only when Laertes breaks down does Odysseus stop. He shows his father the scar. Then he names the pear trees, apple trees, fig trees, and rows of vines that Laertes gave him when he was a child. The orchard becomes a map of a life they both remember. Argos knows him without proof. Euryclea knows the scar beneath the disguise. Penelope knows the secret of the bed. Laertes remembers a child among the trees. The wider world knows Odysseus through his stories. The people closest to him know him through histories they share. But Homer still does not give us a perfectly restored home. The families of the dead suitors come seeking revenge, and Odysseus prepares to fight again. In the fighting, Laertes kills Eupeithes. His son, Antinous, was the first suitor Odysseus killed in the hall. One generation hands the feud to another. Odysseus has returned from war, only to bring the conditions for another war into Ithaca. Athena finally intervenes and imposes peace. That is where the poem leaves him. He is not safely inside the past he wanted back, and he has not clearly learned how to end violence. The cycle stops because a goddess commands it to stop. So I'm not sure we can say that suffering has made Odysseus wiser. It may have made him more cautious, more capable and better at surviving and reclaiming what he believes is his. Whether it has made him better is much harder to answer. And that uncertainty is exactly what later storytellers inherit. Section 4. Every generation's Odysseus. Once you've noticed how unsettled the verdict is, later versions of the Odyssey begin to look less like tributes and more like arguments. In Dante's Inferno, Ulysses does not remain at home. His desire to know the world is too strong. He persuades his aging companions to sail beyond the limits permitted to human beings, and the voyage ends in destruction. This is not simply Homer's Odysseus with a Christian lesson attached. Dante drew on other ancient traditions and invented a final voyage of his own. He took qualities that can look admirable, like curiosity, courage, and eloquence, and asked what they become when no moral boundary can contain them. In Dante's hands, Ulysses has to answer a different accusation. James Joyce turns the story in almost the opposite direction entirely. In Ulysses, Leopold Bloom is not a king returning from war. He is an advertising canvasser moving through Dublin during one ordinary day in 1904. There are no literal Cyclopses, Sirens, or sea monsters waiting for him. Joyce keeps the shape of a difficult homecoming, but changes the scale. He asks whether an ordinary life might be large enough to contain an epic. Could curiosity, humiliation, appetite, compassion, loneliness, and the effort of living beside another person be their own kind of heroic journey? Later writers change something else. Who gets to tell the story? Margaret Atwood's The Penelopiad lets Penelope speak from the afterlife and brings the 12 hanged women into the center of the account. From Odysseus's position, their deaths can be absorbed into the restoration of his household. From the noose, the same ending looks very different. Atwood does not need to pretend Odysseus was never courageous or intelligent. She asks what becomes visible when his survival is no longer the only life that matters. Madeline Miller's Circe shifts the view again. Circe is no longer one dangerous woman in a famous man's adventure. Odysseus becomes one visitor in the much longer story of her life. Seen from there, his charisma, damage, tenderness, and capacity for violence all belong to the same person. The adventure cannot hurry us onwards before we notice. These retellings do not correct Homer in any simple sense. Penelope, Circe, and the enslaved women were already present. What changes is the attention they receive and the authority they have to interpret what happened. When the center moves, the moral balance moves with it. Derek Walcott's Omeros carries the story much further from Ithaca and follows Caribbean characters named Achilles, Hector, Helen, and Philoctet. Its relationship with Homer is deliberate, but it is not obedient. Walcott brings Homeric echoes into histories of colonialism, slavery, displacement, and the Atlantic world, Greece is no longer treated as the unquestioned center of every human journey. It becomes one current among others. None of these writers needed to make Odysseus simple in order to make him new. Nolan's film is another turn in that process, another storyteller deciding which Odysseus a modern audience will meet. There is no neutral way to do that. Even the most faithful adaptation must choose a translation, a tone, a face, a pace, and a moral center. Every one of those choices interprets the story. People kept the text available by performing it, copying it, teaching it, and translating it. What these later writers reveal is how much room the poem left for disagreement. Section 5, the story that refuses to end. When Odysseus and Penelope are finally together, he tells her, "We have not yet reached the end of all our trials." And he means it literally. Long before Odysseus reached Ithaca, Tiresias gave him one of the strangest instructions in the poem. After dealing with the suitors, he must place an oar on his shoulder and walk away from the coast. At first, everybody he passes will recognize it. The sea is still close. Boats and the people who use them belong to the landscape. Then the road turns inland. The shore disappears behind him, and the oar, an ordinary object beside water, begins to look strange. Odysseus must keep walking until he reaches people who know nothing of the sea. He will know when he has gone far enough, when somebody mistakes the oar for a winnowing fan. One drives a ship through water, the other separates grain from chaff. There, where Poseidon's instrument is no longer recognized, Odysseus must plant the oar in the earth. Only then can he make peace with the god whose anger followed him home. The poem ends before he makes that journey. So Odysseus is home, but required to leave again. He is victorious, but Athena has had to stop another cycle of killing. He is finally recognized, but he has met almost every person he loves with a disguise, a lie, or a test. The ending refuses the clean answer the word hero seems to promise. In Homer's world, the word described an exceptional person, someone of unusual power, endurance, and status. Their closeness to the gods helped make their actions part of the collective memory. By that measure, Odysseus is unmistakably heroic. But if we use hero to mean someone whose conduct deserves uncomplicated admiration, the answer changes. Odysseus saves lives, and he spends them. He longs for his family, and he deceives them. He can be restrained, vain, tender, calculating, and brutally violent. His intelligence is metis, the strategic cunning that keeps him alive. But it is also the instinct that makes him so difficult to know. Even polytropos, the first word Homer uses to define him, refuses to hold him still. One age recognizes the survivor and admires him. Another sees the colonizer, the liar, or the perpetrator, and recoils. Odysseus can be a veteran, husband, storyteller, a wanderer, victim, and a hero, sometimes within the same reading. The poem does not make us select one version and discard the rest. The questions it leaves are not comfortable. What is intelligence for if cleverness can save and destroy? Does suffering create wisdom or only endurance? When does justice become vengeance? And who gets excluded when order is restored? So why has humanity spent nearly 3,000 years returning to the story of Odysseus? We have kept returning without ever agreeing that Odysseus was good. Every generation has to decide for itself what the word hero can hold. He makes admiration uncomfortable. Reaching home does not erase what the journey cost. Survival can be an achievement without becoming an acquittal. And the story itself has become a little like the oar. It keeps traveling beyond the world that first gave it meaning. Someone recognizes part of it, misunderstands another part, gives it a new name, and picks it up. The journey begins again. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time, stay curious.